So I'd just like to say welcome to Emma Woodhouse, our guest this week on Crime Guy. We're talking today about a couple of different projects, one of which is connected to Emma's research, which is a Disney show series. Series 2 is coming up in a week or so. And then also she has a novel out called Mercy, which is a fictional novel, but it's very much historical and has a lot of research behind it. So first of all, Emma, welcome. Would you like to just quickly introduce yourself to people who haven't heard our amazing interview from last March, which I will link to?
Hi, my name's Emma. I write fiction and non-fiction. It's all very historical, so even my fiction is very, very well researched, deeply researched. So I've written about a number of real women. So I'm very into writing about women who were not satisfied with the lot that society had given them in Victorian times. So they chose to act in ways that were outside of the box, usually in criminal ways, to attempt to make their lives better. And so I've written about the Victorian London gang boss, Mary Carr. And I've written about a woman who lived in my local town, whose name was Mercy Newton, who I will be discussing later.
Okay, so let's start with A Thousand Blows. And just to recap and to explain why people or why we might be talking about this, is that we both saw this series last sort of March, April time. I think the first series came out. And coincidentally, it was when your novel of Mary Carr was coming out around the same time. But it also features a character called Alice Diamond, which is somebody I know about through my own research and my own writing. And she's, I think, in many ways better known. She's certainly been written about more often. If we can remember back to A Thousand Blows, Mary Carr was actually one of the, if not the main character in my eyes. And of course, Stephen Graham was the male lead, the boxer. So it's all coming back to me now after quite a few months of hiatus. We don't really know exactly where the story's going next, but I do remember that when we spoke last year, you sort of felt that Mary in that show is not the real Mary or is not as accurate historically as perhaps you know.
Various things about the show, sort of historically, are not overly accurate, and the media have kind of pounced on the show and taken things from the show and sort of spread them about in different magazine articles and newspaper articles. And the biggest thing for me is the name of the gang's not the real name of the gang. They're calling them the 40 Elephants. Now, Alice Diamond became the leader of the 40 Elephants in the 1920s. However, Mary Carr was in the 1890s and she was in a gang called the 40 Thieves. Whether those two gangs were the same gang that sort of endured over decades, or whether, from my research, there were so many gangs called the 40 Thieves back in Victorian London. Mary Carr's was just one of them. Lots and lots of women called themselves the Queen of the 40 Thieves. There were other people who had gangs called the 40 Thieves and they'd have a king of the 40 Thieves. Or, there were little groups of boys robbing grocers' shops for eggs and one of them would call himself the King of the 40 Thieves. And it was a very popular name for gangs. Across the country, there was a gang in Wolverhampton, for example, that was called the 40 Thieves as well. Doesn't mean they were all part of the same gang. And so yeah, the name of the guy, every time they say that she's was part of the 40 Elephants, there was never a newspaper report that called her anything to do with 40 Elephants. She was part of the 40 Thieves. And so, for me, that's the very blatant and very obvious kind of stepping stone really into the sort of fictional world that they've created around Mary Carr. But I also think that the show, it has been fantastic in that people are now talking about her and the history is out there and people are starting to sort of really look into her history because she had been largely forgotten.
Of course, the 40 Thieves dates back to, I'm sure it must be connected to Alibaba and the 40 Thieves.
Yes.
That's where they steal
Yeah.
the name from. So there's no original naming or branding here or trademarks if a
No.
gang could have such a thing. And then the 40 Elephants angle comes from the area of London near Elephant and Castle where many of these people lived and worked and
Yeah.
had family ties. So that sort of explains perhaps why there were so many of these gangs. I think any large gang with over 10 people might call itself the 40 Thieves, men or women, from what you're saying.
I mean, there were little gangs of four boys robbing a grocer's that called themselves the 40 Thieves. It was, numerically, I don't think it really mattered.
No.
It was a cool name, and there were lots and lots of pantomimes and stage shows of the 40
Mhm.
Thieves and Alibaba, that were doing the rounds around the country, that were in the music halls, that were in the theatres. And so people had just coined the phrase as a fantastic gang name. They thought they were cool.
So yeah, I think that was the first thing that interested me was when I was doing my Alice Diamond research, I was never quite clear whether this was one loosely related gang that you could trace back to the late 1800s and
Mm.
all the way through to my period, which is the 1920s and beyond. Because Alice Diamond was known in the 60s, and was passing her knowledge onto young female criminals at the end of her life. I can't remember exactly when she died, but it was certainly after the war into the 50s and maybe a bit later than that. Whether this was one franchise thing that lasted, or whether really, in fact, it's just a lot of different people using the same name.
I think as well, people use the phrase they're part of the 40s, and that just meant that they were part of this criminal underclass. And there was some solidarity, I think, between people who considered themselves part of that world. It was an us and them situation. You see a policeman coming, and whose side are you on, sort of thing. But there was an old Kent Road 40 Thieves gang. They were all over the place calling themselves the 40 Thieves. There were a couple of blokes stealing things off barges around the Limehouse area that called themselves the 40 Thieves. And I question, and when I started my research, one of the very first things I remember reading was that this gang had endured for decades and decades, and you could trace them back to the 1700s. And actually, when I looked into it, there had been a gang around Seven Dials calling themselves the Forties, and they'd been. And this is in my book actually that comes out with Pen and Sword about Mary Carr. That a woman called Fair Margaret, she was leading this gang in the sort of early days, and it's highly unlikely that Mary's gang was that gang that just sort of perpetuated. Mary had got her own schemes, she'd got her own friends, she'd got her own sort of associates. And Mary was very good, first of all, at bribery, at sort of cornering someone and accusing them of indecently acting towards herself or one of her girls, and then they'd bribe him for their silence. And as time went on, she seemed to move away from that and do a little bit more of sort of what they call mosking, which is a bit like being a fence, you getting rid of the stolen goods. And she seemed to take that on and be quite successful at that. And so I think, I mean, after her, the next person that really in the newspapers was known as the Queen of the 40 Thieves was a girl called Minnie Duggan. And Minnie Duggan was the antithesis of Mary. So Minnie Duggan was violent. She was very impulsive. She got arrested for really ridiculous things and went to prison regularly for things like assault or for stealing an umbrella or for, that wasn't Mary's kind of gang. That wasn't what Mary did. Mary made a lot of money blackmailing people and getting rid of expensive stolen goods. She didn't go around beating up somebody for a couple of shillings or nicking an umbrella. So, the possibility that that lady, that Minnie took her crown as the Queen of the 40 Thieves and then completely destroyed what Mary had set up, it doesn't seem likely to me. It's another person that was in the area, gave herself that sort of title really once Mary was in prison. So yeah, the gang name for me is a historically it's quite a big sort of thing because I think there's a large conversation about that and about the sort of criminal class that there was and actually organized crime back then. How organized was it?
Well, that's one striking thing I remember about the first series of A Thousand Blows
Mm.
in the scene where they do a big shoplifting for maybe a
Hmm.
department store, a big shop, and
Hmm.
it comes across as very organized,
Yeah.
meticulously planned,
Hmm.
and they've almost got a stopwatch going while they rob this place,
Mm.
and then they get all the stuff into cars, and then it gets spirited away very quickly. That looks impressive.
Hmm.
It sounds like you might be thinking that that's not quite how it was.
That's an Alice Diamond scheme. That's not a Mary Carr. Yeah, Mary Carr was, girls would have gone shoplifting. They certainly would have filled their pockets with things, but it wasn't a great big sort of heist situation with Mary. It was, she was very clever and she did things behind the scenes.
From my memory, it's like you say, they were sort of an underclass. They were very poor girls, at least when they
Mhm.
got started,
Yeah.
but they were targeting very rich men typically. So I think our sympathies from this distance would be with the girls. In fact, they were robbing people who could afford it, basically.
Yeah, they were, it was the poverty that was in London at the time was unreal. You got palaces next to slums and people starving and freezing to death next to princes. And Mary was actually known for her support of local families as well. So there were people who would be banged up and the father would be in prison or whatever, and Mary would be shelling out money for the family. So there's a case of a man in prison whose young daughter was um, very, very poorly, and he knew that she was very, very poorly. And in one of the newspapers, it talked about how he'd been pacing his cell and just unable to rest because he believed that his daughter was, her life was in danger because of whatever illness she'd got. And when he heard that Mary Carr had stepped in and was supporting his daughter, he said, "Oh, I don't need to worry now because it's like she's got two mothers." So she was very well loved by the people that she supported and the people in her area. I think as my sort of research has gone on, and obviously I researched Mary for probably 2.5, 3 years before I wrote the novel, and then on top of that, more research for me to write my nonfiction book. One of the things that I read in one newspaper article that I'd kind of put to one side really when I wrote the novel was that they thought that Mary would have been a brothel housekeeper when she had her house in Stamford Street, which is in the 1890s, sort of around 1895, 1896. And it was only in one real newspaper article that I really sort of found that, and I thought, I don't think so. She was fencing, she was doing other stuff, but actually, the more you look into Stamford Street and the history of Stamford Street, and the more you look into who her neighbours were, and the more you look into the people she was hanging around with, then it's highly likely that she probably did allow her house to be used as a brothel because that was just the way of life there, and lots of women took on that sort of work because it actually made them more money than a conventional job where they
Mm.
would, sort of be working all hours of the day, back-breaking labour when actually sort of, a few shillings or whatever, however much they want to charge. And I don't think Mary would have lifted an eyebrow particularly at that because that was life. And she'd have grown up around people who had to make money just any way they could to survive. So,
Yeah, there were difficult times. It's
mm,
pretty hard for us to imagine that level of poverty from where we are now, and it's almost well, it is Dickensian times, I think. Is Mary just sort of overlapping with the end of the Dickens
yeah,
period where?
Dickens's son was writing stuff at around a similar sort of time. He wrote sort of guides to London and things like that. Charles Dickens Jr. So yeah.
So we've talked there, Emma, about A Thousand Blows, which, if people don't know, is out on Disney Plus. Let's move on to talk about your more recent novel than the Mary Carr novel, which is Mercy. Who is Mercy? What is Mercy, and why did you get into that world?
So Mercy actually is a woman local to where I live. So I'm in Bridgnorth in Shropshire, and Mercy lived in Bridgnorth. And I was actually looking for something local. I'd written about London enough as far as I was concerned at that point, and I wanted to find something that was local to me. And I wanted to find, literally, I was just looking for any story along the River Severn, from sort of Shrewsbury down to Bewdley. And I looked through the British newspaper archives, just to see what I could find. And this story just kept popping up and popping up and popping up. And I thought, this story really wants to be told, but I don't know if there's enough in it to make a book out of it. And the more I looked, the more there was. Mercy's whole life was fascinating. And she actually made British legal history, but she's been forgotten. And I just thought it was an absolute travesty that the story had been forgotten, that the history had been forgotten. But again, like with Mary Carr, there's such an interesting social history as well behind Mercy's story. So Mercy was arrested in 1848 and she was um, charged with matricide, so the murder of her mother. And she made British legal history because she was only the second person ever to have stood trial for the same murder twice. And in fact, she went on to have three trials. And in fact, after her second trial, there were questions regarding should she still even be in prison? Should she have another trial? And legal men wrote to each other, and it was basically agreed that it was so severe a case that she would be on trial until a verdict was found. I don't want to give too many spoilers about her. It's an absolutely fascinating case. Her mother had £500 in the bank, which to Mercy seemed like an absolute fortune, but it actually equated to about 7 shillings and sixpence a week that her mother was living off. It wasn't very much. But Mercy kind of coveted that money and she'd wanted it ever since she was a child, and she didn't have a particularly brilliant relationship with her mother. And Mercy had done quite well in life. She was working as a housekeeper in a very lovely house by the river, and her mother had turned up one stormy night asking for food. Mercy had let her in. They'd had some bread and cheese together. The master of the house, Mercy's boss, he was a bedridden older gentleman, and he was upstairs. And Mercy had the run of the house really, and had done for years. There was one maid in the house as well, Mary Caulfield, and she went off to bed at around 10 o'clock, leaving mother and daughter down in the kitchen together. And Mary Caulfield slept in the same room as the master of the house, Richard Dyer, to make sure that if he needed anything in the night that he would be seen to. And he woke her up making some funny noises at about 2 a.m. And she realised the room was full of smoke, and she threw open the sash and ran downstairs and couldn't find Mercy or her mother anywhere. Ran down the street to get the nephew of Richard Dyer, William Doughty, and he came back with her, and they searched the house and they found Mercy. She was quite drunk. She'd had quite a lot of rum, and they couldn't find her mother, so they set about looking. Mary Caulfield went to the brew house, and the screams that she let out when she discovered Mercy's mother sort of echoed through the house, and she had found a charred corpse in the brew house. And so Mercy was arrested, and yeah, she made legal history. The whole case made legal history and absolutely forgotten, and yet it's a really sort of interesting piece of social history as well. So I get very geeky and kind of, this happened and this happened, this was gruesome, and then I sort of get carried away with the whole the people of Bridgnorth. They wanted her hanged. They calling her a murderer. They amassed outside the town hall when the coroner's inquiry happened. But by the end of her trials, they'd got together 200 men of standing, had created a petition to ask for her to be released. So there's the change in that sort of focus of hanger, 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 and then you've not got a verdict, you need to let her go. It's again that us and them situation. It was the local people saying, there's a bunch of medical men arguing about details when they didn't even see the body, and this woman is in prison, and she's one of us, you need to let her go. Not that the petition had much of an effect because they went on and gave her a third trial, but it's an absolutely fascinating, forgotten piece of history.
There's a couple of things there that strike me as unusual or odd, and we are led to believe that you can only be tried once. You have one court case, right, or
Mm.
be charged and tried once for a particular crime. That's changed recently, hasn't it? But
Mm.
it you can be retried. I think somebody has been retried now, but back in this time, it was supposed to be no double jeopardy or whatever it was
Yep.
called, right? So
Yep.
how on earth was it just public pressure that led to this sort of exception for Mercy then?
There were a couple of very strange coincidences. So, in the coroner's inquiry, one of the jury got very poorly. So, back in those days, they'd lock the jury up with no food, no water. They weren't supposed to sleep. They were supposed to find a verdict. And one of the jurors got very poorly. And so, actually, after the coroner's inquiry, she was sent off to the Shrewsbury prison for the assizes without a proper verdict. And so, that actually happened during one of her trials as well. One of the jurors got very poorly, and so there was no verdict. So that sort of coincidence there obviously didn't help. By the time that her third trial came along, there were about 10 possibilities that of a sort of murder modus operandi, if you like. What that the jury was sort of given by the judge. If she did this, she's guilty. If you think she did this, she's guilty. If you think she did it this way, she's guilty. And he basically said, you don't have to decide how she did it, because that's the jury had to say, yes, she did it, and this is how we believe she did it. And by the end of it, they said, you don't have to agree on how she did it. If you think it was one of these ways, then she did it, and then she's guilty. And if not, then she's not guilty. So I think that the legal system was sort of holding itself up a little bit as well. But the sort of change in the local people was phenomenal as well. So when she came out of prison, the local community wanted her to be released, whereas before they'd wanted to see her dangle from the end of a rope. So um, yeah, it's a fascinating piece of history, and it's sort of it's captured a lot of the sort of imagination, I think, of local people as well. I've given some lovely talks, and lots and lots of people have been fascinated by her history. Um, yeah, it was like my own little Da Vinci trail, trying to sort of work out what had happened during her life. Her whole life story is fascinating.
Yeah, I can see that this would be interesting locally. I mean, it really should be a national story, and
Mm.
hopefully your book will be read beyond Bridgnorth. And it already has been, and it's been out for a little while now. So, oh, there's so many things we could dig into with this. I know you want to sort of protect some of it because it is a novel that you've written at the moment. You may or may not have plans to do a non-fiction version later on. Yeah, so it seems from what you were saying that Mercy and her family were not particularly wealthy, and what I remember from my sort of crime research is that often, if there is a miscarriage of justice or some question marks around a case, the women tend to be particularly harshly dealt with. And I'm thinking of Ruth Ellis now, of course, where really, whether or not she did or didn't shoot somebody, she was under such duress and in such a sort of fragile state of mind that perhaps these days we would be a bit more sort of calmly reflective of the situation and the circumstances.
Mm.
What you're saying, and in fact, is that the public were initially they believed she'd done it
Yeah.
and they wanted the death penalty.
They did. And her cousin, sort of 25 years earlier, had murdered his wife just down the road. So their family name was synonymous almost with murder. But when she was arrested and she was taken to Shrewsbury Prison, she said, "This'll be another Seven Hall job." And Seven Hall is where her cousin lived and where he murdered his wife. And he was hanged where everybody could see, just above the gatehouse at Shrewsbury Prison. So people would have amassed in the streets to see her cousin hang. And she was carted off, I think, essentially believing that she would hang.
Well, I'm definitely going to get stuck into this one now. It sounds absolutely fascinating. It doesn't sound like she had much of a alibi, in the sense that there was this fire, but the body wasn't found in the place where there was the fire.
So the fire was in the kitchen. So it was clear that the fire was in the kitchen because the sofa in front of the fire was smoking and charred. There are a few sort of theories, obviously, as to how the body got to the brew house. One of the theories is that her mother set herself on fire. Her mother was known to smoke a pipe in bed, and she'd put one of those tin mugs on her lap with a candle in it so she could see what she was doing. She'd smoke a pipe. She'd fallen asleep before. Twice in the past she'd set herself on fire, smoking a pipe in bed. But another theory is that she was doused in flammable liquid. There was lamp oil missing, and possibly sloshed upon the sofa. And then obviously the sofa was charred, but also the door frame of the kitchen door was charred part the way up. So potentially Anne, her mother, might have set herself on fire and then run to the brew house to try to get where the water butts were, or she may have been set on fire and then dragged to the brew house. There was a lot of water on the floor in the brew house, so either she'd been sort of dousing herself with water or someone else had doused her with water. But obviously that's a matter of conjecture.
Sounds like a proper whodunit.
Yeah,
Yeah, it sounds
definitely.
absolutely fascinating. Actually, almost tangentially, we've been watching a documentary over the holidays about the murder in the post office,
Right.
which is very, very, very loosely linked to the Horizon scandal. But essentially, there was a woman's body found in a rural post office in North Yorkshire, and there were various views about what had happened and whether the husband could have been involved at all. Was he involved? Did he do it? All this kind of stuff. And it
Mm.
seemed that a lot of that trial was based on establishing a motive for whether he might have wanted to do it or not. And I remember thinking while I was watching that presumably having a motive can be persuasive in the
Mhm.
sense of giving you explaining a reason, but they spent so much time on whether he would have wanted to kill his wife and not enough time in it, from what I could see, on whether he actually did.
Yeah.
Because you might want to kill a lot of people. Very few people carry that through. So it sounds like the motive here was money, simple as that, the £500.
Yeah, and they also knew there were a lot of people that came forward and had stories of the behaviour between mother and daughter and how violent Mercy had been towards her mother in the past and the things that she'd said about her mother in the past. And even her own uncle, her mother's brother, sort of stood up in court and said, she's done this to her mother in the past. She's treated her mother badly in the past. The local surgeon did the same. And in fact, the William Doughty, the nephew of her boss, had banned her mother from coming around the house at one point because it kicked off between mother and daughter regularly. So, their relationship was known to be fiery.
Quite literally, yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, well, you've sold me on that one. I'm going to get hold of Mercy and we'll put links in the show notes as well. I would like to ask you, I think we've both seen trailers for the Lucy Worsley series that's
Mhm.
coming out, and I think that will be out way before this episode. But at some stage, and I do like her murdery kind of series. She's done an Agatha Christie one. She's done quite a
Mhm.
few over the last few years. But
Yeah.
I think you mentioned to me that Mercy is featured in that series too.
I believe so, yeah. Her research team were in touch with people in Bridgnorth recently, and I believe that Mercy will be getting an airing with Lucy Worsley. She was also mentioned in the History Today magazine. There was an article on her where they used her nickname Kitty, Kitty Newton. She was known as to her mother and her friends. So, yeah, I believe that Lucy Worsley will be talking about our Mercy shortly, yeah.
It can only increase knowledge of the case, and hopefully people will be Googling for Mercy and find your novel as well. But I thought we'd maybe just finish this first chat with just a look at what you're doing next. Have you got any more books planned? Are you working on something now?
Yeah, I've just sent off a first draft of my next nonfiction. And I have some top secret novel news, which I suppose if this isn't going out straight away, I could probably tell you a little bit about that. That I do have another true crime novel set locally, which will be coming out in November, with the same publisher that published Mercy. Um, and it's about a local lady who professed to be a witch, and she was murdered in 1857. And it's about her life and about her murder and about what happened in that crime and that sort of situation.
That sounds fascinating. So
Mm.
you are busy because you're not a full-time writer by any means, are you?
No, I'm not, but I feel like I am. I feel like I've got two full-time jobs.
Well, I've done a lot more writing in the last year or two, and I think partly it is just discipline and organization, isn't it?
Yeah,
I've been
yeah,
writing on trains, finding ways to write when I'm out and about and not just at home,
yeah.
as I'm at home less this year as well. I think, yeah, do you find that if you just organize yourself, there is time?
Oh, definitely. It helps as well that I get completely obsessed, as you can probably tell when I'm talking. I get utterly obsessed with whatever it is that I'm writing about. And so for me, to relax in the evening, lots of people need a bit of sort of downtime and watch a bit of TV. I do my writing, because that for me, that's what I am very into at that moment. So yeah, I do a lot of that. And a lot of I drive, so I suppose I drive for about an hour a day. And during that time, I'll be mulling things over, and I'll quite often come up with an idea or come up with a viewpoint or come up with something that I want to put into my writing while I'm driving as well.
Yeah, I think you sound very similar to me in that respect. I was reading a Blandings Castle P.G. Woodhouse over
Ah,
Christmas,
lovely.
and he says something like there's a certain type of person who relaxes by doing a different type of work.
Mm,
In other words, you're not good at relaxing and just zoning out with Netflix.
no.
And I find, especially with true crime, so this is a crime show, it's almost annoyingly addictive. You get stuck on details and they pull you in, and then you get more details and you get more down this sort of rabbit hole. It is, for certain type of mind, it is a very addictive thing to research, isn't it?
Oh, definitely. And I think, I mean, last time I spoke to you, you mentioned that a particular podcast, which I then binge listened to, and now I'm still listening to the odd episode when it comes out, and you do get sort of drawn into different cases that really sort of grip you.
Yeah, and I've just finished listening to a New Yorker podcast about the White House farm murders in the 80s, which has a few new bits of information that were new and I didn't know about. But I've got a little bit more skeptical of true crime, sort of entertainment style documentaries. You know,
Mm.
whenever I feel like the way they split the episodes or the ad breaks is designed to pull you through it, it almost turns it into a thriller. And I certainly here, I try to stay away from that because I
Mm.
feel I can see the mechanics behind it now. I've seen enough of them.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I've got into over the last year as well is I've given a couple of talks on the ethics of fictionalizing criminals and looking at the sort of ethics of criminology um, and things like that. And so that sort of sensationalizing of the criminal rather than the victim. You know, you've got, I think there's a fine balance. And so that's one of the things that I'm quite mindful of in my writing is that I don't want, although obviously you can tell I was fascinated by Mary and I was fascinated by Mercy, but I want to humanize them. I don't want to put them on a pedestal, which is what I try to do through my writing.
I've just noticed a contrast there, which is that Mary, in effect, is the criminal, isn't she?
Mm,
Whereas
yes.
Mercy could be a victim. Is she? You know what?
Yeah.
It, whichever way you look at it, it sounds like she's the victim of circumstance and poverty and all the
Yeah.
pressures that Mary experienced as well in a different
Mhm.
period of time. Maybe just looping back to A Thousand Blows, because you just raised that topic of true crime as fiction. Oh, and I read that a really famous American novelist is going to do some true crime series as well. Harlan Coben, I think it was, who's well known
Mm.
for his fiction, but he's now presenting a true crime series. So it's like blurring the edges and the boundaries there.
Mm.
But one thing I will say about A Thousand Blows and your novelization of Mary as well is it does bring in a different audience. You know, there are some people who just won't watch true crime for whatever reason, that they
Yeah.
don't think of it. Whereas they'll watch a drama
Yeah.
and they'll learn about history that way. I
Yes.
mean, you could argue, you know, does it matter if we've all forgotten about Mary Carr? Does it matter whether it's accurate or not? You know,
Mm. When I started sort of writing and anything that wasn't totally sort of factual really irked me. Um, but and one of the things when I started looking at ethics as well and the ethics of fictionalizing real people, my thought was always, am I doing right by the dead person? But really the ethics is, are you doing right by the audience? That's the actual ethics now. The dead person is anybody's game almost, unless they have relatives who are going to sue you.
mm.
The sort of the deceased historical figure is you can do what you like with them almost. So it's then it became for me very much, you know, how do I want to sort of deal with this person? And I've always wanted to do right by that person too. Um, you know, I can't get rid of the fact that they were a real person. And so I don't want to particularly sort of make up stuff, make them seem. I could have written Mercy as an utter villain if I'd have wanted to, but I wanted to humanize her because I wanted to do right by her and by the reader. I wanted, you know, that sort of balance. So um, for me, that's very much my motivation. But obviously, when with something like A Thousand Blows, it's sensationalist and it's dragging in the viewers, and you know, it is getting people into that history in a very powerful way. You know, A Thousand Blows has had millions more sort of viewers than my book will ever have readers, I'm sure. But um, you know, different audiences, I suppose, and just different approaches. And when I sort of, I've had to work out what sort of a writer I want to be. And I can't be that sort of sensationalist writer. I'm very, very much into the history, and that's what's led me into my nonfiction writing. And that's, you know, my novels aren't heavy, as in the history isn't heavy, heavy, but they are as factual as I can make them and still have them as a novel and have people sort of sit and enjoy them and not be swamped down too much in detail. So you know, that's who I am as a writer. So yeah, but you know, every sort of representation of history is a construct.
Mm.
And you know, A Thousand Blows is one construct. My book's a different construct.
I'm thinking now of almost like a third way of doing this as well. So when we last spoke, it was just before Dope Girls came out on BBC, and I
Mm.
got very heavily into that, partly because one of the sort of breakout actors in that, Umi Myers, was just so compelling and such a brilliant portrayal of a role that I actually saw her in Dracula in the autumn as well, and she was just as good in that in person. But what they did in Dope Girls was they used first names which were historical figures,
Yeah.
but they deliberately and specifically didn't mention any last names, and they did develop the characters in a different way. So there's one called Kate, who is obviously to me based on Kate Mayrick, who appears in my non-fiction book. And there was a question mark over her, whether she ran brothels or whether she was just a nightclub owner. You know, could she have made the money she made just from selling alcohol? Would she, you know, and so they had three girls who were all you could if you wanted to look back and see who they were meant to be,
Yeah.
but their life stories don't match up. You know, Billy, who's played by Yumi Myers, dies very young. And she
Mm.
doesn't die in Dope Girls, and they were intending a second series. So there they've blurred it by using a lot of real material, but they've changed enough of it to make it quite clear it's fiction. And I suppose
Yeah.
there's that approach as well, which actually frustrated me because
Mm.
to me it was so obviously Kate Mayrick. I wanted it to be her, and they'd
Yeah.
used a different backstory completely.
Yeah. That's the danger of us being history geeks, isn't it? I think that if we weren't that way inclined, we'd just sit back and enjoy it probably. But it's it's like the people that look out for TV aerials in the background of a historical drama, isn't it? We're just sort of, oh,
Yeah.
that's not how it should be. But yeah.
Well, it's always the case. So
Mhm.
my day job is in technology, and been doing that long enough that I'm perceived as an expert. You know, if you've got these kind of cybersecurity dramas and you actually put the real stuff in, it's actually very boring.
Yeah.
And it's much more interesting and I'm sure this is the same for police procedurals. You know, a police
Mm.
officer would say, well, this couldn't actually happen. But if we did what actually happens, nobody would watch it.
Yeah.
So there is that. I am more sympathetic to the producers and the actors now
Yeah.
because if it's not watchable, it won't get another series, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Just finish off by saying thank you to Emma Woodhouse for this chat, and I wish you all the best with Mercy in particular, but I'll put links in the show notes as mentioned.